right, number 11, slavery did not end in 1865. So what do I mean by that? Basically what I mean is at 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation reached Texas, and that's what Juneteenth is celebrated over. But where were a lot of those slaves supposed to go? They really didn't have anywhere to go. So what happened was called sharecropping. Welcome back to another video. Today we are going to talk about the occasion of the day, which is Juneteenth. So today we're going to talk about a concept called the Sasha and the Zamina. So the reason why I want to start out the video with that concept is because the Sasha, what that is, it's an Eastern African tradition. Basically talks about the Sasha are the dead that have not been forgotten. So the dead that have not been forgotten still live on in the minds of the people who remember them. So I just want to highlight some people and some events so that we can remember them, so that we can kind of frame what is going on today, so we can frame the present in terms of that. Whereas the Zamina, they are basically the dead who have been forgotten, the very distant past, the very distant dead, which eventually we all return to that realm, I guess you could call it. So I think that a lot of the stuff that I have to say today is falling into that realm. People forget about it. People don't realize how recent a lot of the oppression happened. They don't realize that, this stuff, people, you hear the whole phrase like slavery wasn't that long ago. We're going to get into that because it really wasn't. So anyways, let's get into number one. All right, number one, the way that we're going to format this is we're going to go in somewhat chronological order, but it's kind of all over the place. And I'm still reading up on my own history, but it's been a good eye-opening experience is what I'll say. So number one is 2 blocks down the street from the current New York Stock Exchange are where slaves used to be exchanged. So you could exchange slaves two blocks down from the street where you can now buy stocks on the stock exchange. So the other interesting thing about that is that you could also invest in slave companies. You can invest in basically slavery. The reason why I think that is historically significant is because it was all business driven. Like a lot of the movement to the colonies, it was business driven. People came here to make money, and certain people came here to be made money off of. So this country and the wealth of this country was built off the backs of the slaves and the conquered. And the other thing that's important to me about that is that those companies, even when slavery was abolished, well, what did businesses do? What do business owners do? They pivot, right? So all of that wealth that was built up as a result of slavery, those business owners pivoted that, just like Elon Musk went from PayPal to SpaceX and to Tesla. Those business owners went from slavery to all of the current assets that we see held in, for lack of a better term, white hands today. Number 2, slaves were seen as not just property, but as collateral. You could claim a slave on your balance sheet for your business. You could claim a slave as collateral for a loan at the bank. So even, the banks were in on it. The government was in on it. Everybody was in on it. Number 3, I thought this was interesting. Slaves costed about $12 per year to maintain and generated $55 approximately in revenue on average. So in other words, slaves gave you about a 500% return. So if you think about a period of time where, you tell somebody that you can go to the Americas and you can get a 500% return on your money, a lot of people are going to do that, and then those slaves themselves who are building the wealth, they don't get any access to that wealth. They don't get any access to the fruits of that labor. Number 4, in 1790, the Naturalization Act established blacks as an underclass. This law basically said that you could become a citizen if you are a free white person of good character. So you had to live in America for, I think it was about 2 years. You had to be a free white person. So you couldn't be indentured. You couldn't be, not white. And basically it just established by law, the law of the land was that blacks were an underclass. Number 5, the Alamo was fought over slavery. What did the Texans do? They wanted to fight for their slaves, so they fought to maintain slavery. Number 6, the Onus Adams Treaty of 1819 and the Seminole War. So Seminole War, once again, was fought over slavery with the Spanish. The Spanish did not want to maintain slavery. Blacks actually owned land within Spanish Florida. Native Americans owned the land of Spanish Florida before they were all expelled to Oklahoma. Interesting thing about that is that Andrew Jackson, without the permission of the government, went down there and raided black land, raided Indian land without actually getting the permission of the government. So he took that land from those black and native people. One part of the treaty, the Onus-Adams Treaty of 1819, was that people who own land in Florida would be able to maintain their land. So basically what that means is that if this treaty is still valid, and then those people who were expelled from the land, once they bought it from France with this treaty, that means that they still should be rightful owners to that land. So that's a little bit of a historical controversy there. Number 7, this one shouldn't be controversial, but it still is. Slavery was the cause of the Civil War. The Civil War was fought over slavery. You know, you hear this tyranny of the government argument, you hear this states' rights argument. It's like states' rights to do what? Is fought over slavery. So I feel like if anybody out there hears the whole notion of, no, it was fought for states' rights, like states' rights to what? Number 8, 1/3 of slaves actually emancipated themselves. So this whole idea of, you know, slaves not knowing where to go or slaves being happy in slavery, most slaves actually ran away. And the ones that didn't, it's probably because they didn't know where to go. They didn't have anywhere to go. And of the slaves that emancipated themselves, a lot of them went and joined the Union Army. So if the Civil War was not fought over slavery, then why is it that so many slaves wanted to fight for the North? Why would that be? Number 9, most respected historians will tell you that there were not any black Confederates. And when there were black Confederates, they were cooks, they were servants, they were not soldiers. And from my research, there was 1 or 2 regiments that were established that were actual combat soldiers once the South started getting very desperate. And those soldiers were never actually armed, because why would you arm people who you just spent, you know, generations beating and enslaving? Why would you arm them? What do you think they're going to do? Number 10 is the Freedmans Bank controversy. So this one happened right after slaves were freed, and they all put so the Freedmen's Bank was basically established to help them have somewhere to put money. So they put their money, a lot of them, into the Freedmen's Bank, and this bank went out and they basically did kind of what banks do today, and they got greedy, they made bad loans, and they went insolvent. So basically, this bank robbed a lot of the early free blacks of a lot of their money. 57 million in that day's dollar was taken basically by this Freedmen's Bank. So it seemed like as soon as blacks became free, they immediately became, you know, they were getting screwed over and over again, which we're about to get into some of that. I guess you could call this one 9.5 concerning the black Confederates. The term Uncle Tom, it's actually a misnomer. If anybody's actually read Uncle Tom's Cabin out there, Uncle Tom was the one who refused to beat blacks. Uncle Tom is the one who refused to sell out, you know, his fellow blacks. The person who actually sold out their fellow blacks was Sambo. He was basically, you know, right behind his slave owner. He was the person who people refer to as Uncle Tom. He was kind of like Uncle Ruckus, and if anybody's seen the Boondocks out there, that's who Sambo was. So if anything, if anybody's going to call somebody a derogatory term to mean white loving, black hating black, it should be Sambo, not Uncle Tom. All right, number 11, slavery did not end in 1865. So what do I mean by that? Basically what I mean is at 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation reached Texas, and you know, that's what Juneteenth is celebrated over. But where were a lot of those slaves supposed to go? They really didn't have anywhere to go. So what happened was called sharecropping. So essentially what would happen is those slaves were working on their old master's land, and you could basically what they would do is the masters would give the slaves a loan so that they could have food to eat and things like that. And the loans would be so great that the slaves would go into so much debt that even when they did get that share of the crop that they made, it wasn't enough to pay back the loan. So they were effectively still enslaved on those plantations. This continued on until about 1940, until the Second World War. So slavery, in effect, didn't really end until 1940. So that's what, 80 years ago? That's only a few generations ago. So a lot of people that are alive today, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, were born essentially as slaves. A lot of great-grandparents were born as illiterate slaves. So if you expect that crop of people to basically build a significant amount of wealth in that short amount of time, coming from that low of an economic background, it's a little bit ridiculous. And if you know that, you know how ridiculous it is. Okay, number 12 is the 1898 Wilmington Massacre. So this was basically during Reconstruction, where blacks were supposed to be integrated into society. They were supposed to be able to form their own government, participate in government. And what happened was Wilmington, North Carolina, there was a huge raid of Wilmington, North Carolina. They destroyed a lot of black property. They destroyed the only black newspaper in the area. They destroyed several $1 million worth of black wealth, and they killed multiple black people. It was followed up also by the destruction of Black Wall Street. So at the time in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was considered one of the richest black areas. So you remember those landowning blacks that got sent over to Oklahoma. Now they're in Oklahoma, now they're free, all that good stuff. And well, what happens? Their entire town just gets leveled, basically. The only way that it was eventually stopped was the National Guard stepped in and declared martial law. So there were a lot of blacks killed, there was a lot of black wealth destroyed in the process. And things like this were just pervasive throughout history after slavery ended. All right, 14 is redlining. So we've already gone over this in other past videos if you're not new here, but basically for those of you that are new that have never heard of redlining, what basically the lenders did that were lending on houses is they drew red lines around the black neighborhoods during segregation, and they just gave those people a hard time essentially. So it was harder to get a loan in those areas, and those areas, when they went to appraise the houses, they appraised the houses at lower values. So that essentially just on paper robbed black people of getting any wealth in their hands. It robbed people just directly of, you know, the biggest asset in most families, which is the home. All right, so bringing it into present day. So obviously there's been some injustices through the past, and just 80 years ago was when slavery really ended through sharecropping. But today, even with the COVID-19 situation, in April, there was a study that showed that 40% of black businesses have gone under due to COVID-19, whereas 17% of white business has gone under. So basically that's just, you know, that power balance is just shifting once again, still to this day. So that research study is done by the University of California at Santa Cruz, and business ownership is very important to, you know, wealth building in a community. On the topic of business ownership, 13% of the population is black, whereas 7% of the businesses are black owned. And of those 7% of the businesses that are black owned, they generate 1.3% of revenues in America. So in other words, of the 13% of America that blacks are, they generate 1.3% of revenues. So it's about just over 1% of the money that is, you know, passed around in America actually ends up in black hands. All right, number 17, there are just over 2 million black-owned businesses. 1.9 million of them have no employees, and 124,000 have employees. So about 5% of black-owned businesses actually employ people. So when you think about the unemployment rates racially, it's very easy to understand why, you know, if there is discrimination out there, which, you know, there's studies that suggest there is, that if there are so few blacks employing people, then it's going to be a little bit harder to be employed if you yourself are black. And of those 124,000 businesses that do employ people, they generate about 103 billion in revenues. So if you just assume that those revenues are being converted to profits about 10% margin, then that basically means that we've got about 10 billion in profits that's going into the Black community through those businesses. So if you were to buy that at a 15 price to earnings ratio, which is a pretty high price, I'd say, for privately owned business, you could buy that for $150 billion. So that means that Apple could buy all Black businesses and they'd still have over $90 billion left over. So just Apple, just one company, could buy every Black business and they would still have $90 billion left over. So just to give you a little illustration of the power dynamic there. So anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully you guys enjoy some of these fun facts. I mean, the Apple thing to me is shocking. Just like one company, literally, you could probably do that with a lot of other companies. I bet, if you were to go look at Microsoft's balance sheet, they could probably afford all Black businesses. If you were to look at Amazon's balance sheet, they could probably afford all Black businesses. So if you look at the power dynamic, just one huge multinational corporation could afford essentially all of the Black labor. What does that kind of look like? So anyways, hopefully you guys like this video, and I'll see you guys in the next video.